Thank you all for joining us for the first time or again in person or on Zoom. Good evening or very, very late night, Beijing, and good afternoon, Ithaca. The Preston H. Thomas Memorial Symposium explores areas of knowledge related to architecture and brings outstanding speakers together whose presence, thoughts, and expertise enriches and inspires our work here. The series is made possible by a generous gift to the college from Mr. and Mrs. Leonard Thomas of Auburn, New York, in memory of their son, Preston H. Thomas. So thank you so much to the Thomas family for this event. In yesterday's introduction, I mentioned Rem Koolhaas and his increasing interest in the early 2000s in looking away from cities, where he had initially directed our attention, and towards the countryside. AI, robotics, automation, he believed, were in many cases more actively explored and experimented within the countryside rather than the city. For these reasons and others, the countryside began to receive attention too. But in these binaries, something important was missed, and that's the zone of flux and dynamism between these two realms being a realm unto itself in need of investigation. So this fringe is described using terms like ambiguous or patchy and neither nor, something not easily describable. And I think even if we look at the posters that are beautifully exhibited on the wall outside the incredible exhibition that everyone should go and see in the Bibliowitz Gallery, even the posters reflect this kind of glitchiness of the space that is in between. And those posters are by Wang Nan, and I invite you all to kind of think about what they mean. The zone is a collision zone, a crash zone between the city's material and technological evolution and the cultural and spatial practices of the non-city. So last night we heard the beginnings of this conversation on how ideas from urban practices evolved in rural situations, how technologies merged with local labor and culture and material, how cultural institutions found new synergy in places like mines and ruins, and how local rural inhabitants were able to take ownership and find agency with designers from external contexts. Today we will collectively give our attention to this hinterland, focusing on technological rural-urban and experimental rural-urban. Thanks to Professor Leslie Locke and fellow Hansi Wang for their insight and thoughtfulness in bringing us all together to address this emerging condition. And we are so grateful for all of our speakers. To introduce the guests fully and the topic more deeply, I welcome and thank the incredible curator and mastermind of this event, Professor Leslie Locke.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the second day of the panel discussion for this Preston Thomas Symposium titled Fringe, New Centers for Architecture and Urbanism. As we have a different set of audience and speakers today, part of yesterday's introduction will overlap with today a little bit. So to start, some of you may wonder, what is fringe and why is it relevant? Especially given that by its very linguistic definition of a fringe is, I quote, not part of the mainstream, unconventional, peripheral, or even extreme, end quote. The symposium argues that the fringe, an ambiguous and ubiquitous zones that forms a wide range of territorial landscapes, which can be characterized as neither distinctly urban nor distinctly rural, is central to today's discourse on architecture and urbanism. Driven by narratives of unrelenting and perpetual urbanization, the fringe constitutes the global engine for rural transformation and urban growth, a site for extractive industries, a territory for agricultural and technological production, a continuous land supply for architectural development, and the expansion of urbanites. Emerging as the predominant context for current and future urban development, the fringe embodies contradicting adjacencies that are situated outside the often preconceived binaries of rural versus urban, natural versus man-made, remote versus connected. Several theorists have taken note of this emergent ambiguous territory, such as urban researcher Terry McGee, who conceptualized the notion of the Dakota in 1990. The term is derived from the Bahasa Indonesian desa, meaning village, and kota, meaning city. Desa-kotas are transformed areas that blend the rural and the urban, particularly in Asia. Found in the peripheries of urban agglomerations, this typological urban fringe mix constitutes an open territory which enables a wide array of land usages and triggers broad invention. Redefining architectural agency across scales, fringe innovations range from state-of-the-art and adaptive material usage in construction to the development of atypical spatial morphologies and programmatic urban adjacencies. Formerly understood as peripheral, these multivalent rural urban zones constitutes new conceptual centers for architecture innovation. Containing some of the world's most intensely altered rural urban contexts, East and Southeast Asia has provided a fertile seedbed for research on global fringe architecture and urbanism. Bring together innovative design and research through the lens of the built environment today, the symposium questions: how do the material and technological changes brought about by urbanization collide with the spatial, cultural, and social practices of the rural? How do such meetings create or alter the spatial conditions of agency and interconnection, from the digital to the traditional, from the informal to the infrastructural, within the rural urban? To explore these questions, the symposium is organized into three thematized panels across 2 locations. Yesterday's panel took place in Beijing, and today's 2 panels took place in Ithaca. And we are looking them through the theme of rural iterations, technological rural urban, and experimental rural urban. Over the course of 2 days, 12 designers, researchers, and educators convened to share their iterative work in the rural areas, expressed through technologically informed design approaches, hybrid construction systems, and built projects for the fringe. In parallel to the symposium, their works are highlighted in an accompanying exhibition in the Bubowitz Gallery that offers a dive into the expansive range of projects across geographic and cultural contexts. Today, together, the panels and exhibition aim to unpack the fringe's spatial, ecological, and technological capacities to reveal new strategies that strive to be more environmentally conscious, socially equitable, and architecturally adaptive. Yesterday's keynote and first panel in Beijing, themed Rural Iterations, focused specifically on recent works that iterate upon China's rural territories. In their keynote lecture, Lu Wenyu and Wang Shu from Amateur Architecture Studio contextualized their recent engagement in work in the Shibian village in rural Zhejiang province, where local techniques, environmental consideration, and labor economies became crucial considerations. Xu Tiantian from DNA Architecture, Design and Architecture situated her work as acupuncture, precise interventions that emerge from a deep engagement with the local communities, from local quarries to urban connectors to bamboo forests. Songyue Hao from SUP Atelier situated his work in relation to consideration about embedded and operative carbon in architectures that also consider adaptive strategies and reuse. And Song Gang from Atelier CNS spoke about material innovation and bamboo construction and the associated knowledge transfer between architects and local communities. What struck me as particularly powerful about yesterday's panel was the deep and thorough commitment to building practice and architectural production. In these projects, the rural is reclaimed as a repository of architectural materials and methods, which had been gradually lost during urbanization, and reiterated to produce new architecture that is nonetheless highly contextualized and connected to the local culture. Sometimes this reclamation is literal, such as the repurposing of material and site, sometimes methodological, and sometimes programmatic. Today's first panel, Technological Rural Urban, looks at both the changing building traditions and provocative speculations of rural urban futures, particularly on how technology can help to review moments of transition and hybridity between the rural and the urban. Working with multi-scale approaches, the speakers' research projects trace and intervene in the technological, economic, and spatial infrastructure that have blurred the boundaries between the urban centers and their rural hinterlands. The infrastructures and networks of urbanization have produced new livelihoods and industries that have changed the everyday spaces as well as the social and environmental landscape. So past collective construction practices in the rural context have been homogenized into standard building systems. Through the widespread use of internet and e-commerce, the social and economic fabrics of the countrysides are now ever more connected with cities. And the intermingling of urban and agricultural land use and settlements has produced emergent patterns of morphological transformations within such fringe conditions. The work done by the speakers within these territories in this panel is therefore likewise multifaceted in their scales, proposing alternative models of urban futures based on deep and thorough analysis of the rural-urban territories. In the second panel today, Experimental Rural Urban at 4:25 p.m., is situated around the innovative projects and histories within the fringe that are both rooted in local material practices and highly experimental approaches. The speaker's work demonstrates that the rural areas is not stagnant or confined by tradition, but a rich, resilient, and potent space for construction innovation. There will be a coffee break between the two panels at 4, and we will end the day with a reception for the exhibition opening in the Milstein Dome at 6:30. Before we start today's lecture, I would like to thank the Thomas family for the generous funding support for the Preston H. Thomas Memorial Lecture Series, without which this event would not be possible. I would also like to thank the following individuals and groups whose support has been paramount in realizing the symposium. Thank you to Dean Mi Jin-yoon and the Center for Cities for supporting my research in this area. Thank you to our Department Chair, Caroline O'Donnell, for her continued guidance and leadership, as well as the Cornell China Center team and the Director Ying Hua for co-hosting and moderating the event in Beijing. The AAP Communications and IT teams, thanks Eric, for your support in this event and exhibition. And then a special thanks goes to our incredible exhibition team consisting of our current students and alumni, BARC student Sophie Chang, MARC students Hunter Huang and Cynthia Ko, and our BARC alum Yu Chang Jia. And most importantly, I would like to thank our design teaching fellow Hanzi Wang for her extraordinary support and invaluable input in organizing this event. Thank you very much, Hanzi. So moving on to our program today, I would like to introduce the speakers of our first panel. The first speakers of our panel is Stephen Cairns from the Future City Laboratory at ETH. The title of his presentation today is Experiments in the Urban-Rural Hybridity in Monsoon Asia. Stephen's current work is focused on the complex patterns of settlements emerging from the predominantly rice-growing hinterlands of many large cities in Monsoon Asia. His practice-oriented research projects include the Expandable House and Agropolitan Seed Town. His books include Building Must Die, A Perverse View of Architecture, co-authored with James M. Jacobs by the MIT Press, and the Future Cities Lab Indicia series, co-edited with the Divisari Tunis. And so please join me in welcoming Stephen.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Caroline, for the introduction. Leslie, for conceptualizing this, and Hansi, of course, it's quite a remarkable team. You get the feeling of the energy, even through the email, even long distance. So thank you very much. It's a remarkable curated group of people. I won't even begin to talk about the legacy of the school and its current formulation, if you like. So there are many, many reasons it's exciting for me to be here. I'm going to talk about some recent work we've been doing at the Future Cities Lab. There are a couple of technological threads which I'll highlight as we go along. It's not always self-evident where that technology is, but I'd like to kind of draw that out as we go along. I'll talk a little bit, and excuse a slightly academic introduction. I'm going to talk a little bit about urbanization and some of the themes that Leslie talked about as well, about the emergence of the fringe, the urban-rural fringe, the dilemmas of thinking about urbanization as a city-centric issue. And then I'll talk a little bit more about Terry McGee's work, the Desakota hypothesis, just a couple of slides on that, and I'll talk. Then the bulk of what I'm going to present will be talking about how does an urbanist and an architect respond to that intellectual legacy, which, as Leslie said, has been around for 20, 30 years now. So it's a very exciting opportunity in a way to revisit some of their work through the lens of design and fabrication. I'm going to begin with a little data experiment, and this is the first of the technological inputs, if you like. This is a piece of software that was designed in the lab, so we are architects masquerading as software designers. We're working with other colleagues in shaping this software, and I'm going to simply show you two locations, common data sets for two locations. So this is, I won't tell you where this is, maybe you can guess as we go along. It's a bit disorienting at the beginning. We're going to put some population density data. And this is people per square kilometre you see on the side. So we're going to set that, I think, at 1,000 people per square kilometre. So that's quite dense. This is more than suburban density. The data is quite pixelated because it's relatively low density. We're going to add cropland data. It's quite unusual to put cropland and density data together. Because we normally they're mutually exclusive in terms of urban definition, and we're going to put nightlight data, which is often regarded as a proxy for GDP. So what we have on the page is density data at an urban level. We have the presence of crops and the presence of relative wealth. And then we intersect those data sets. So this white line is showing the intersection of those three data sets. And then we're going to zoom out. And for those of you who know the geography of Zurich, you'll recognize this is central Switzerland, and this is an image of Zurich centered on Zurich. And if you keep an eye on the numbers on the far right-hand side, you can see at this scale the area that corresponds to those three data sets. The intersection of those three data sets is 84,000 hectares. And they're important data sets because they are typically mutually exclusive by conventional definitions of the city. The city is often described as the place where there is no agriculture, where there is no crops, and where there is a certain kind of density and there is a certain kind of GDP. So just keep that idea in mind. I'm going to take you to the next exercise. So this is the same data sets and the same scale in another location. I'm going to reveal it straight away. This is the city of Jakarta. So just keep in mind the comparative possibilities here. So we switch on the same data. It's relatively low density, pixelated, as you can see, low resolution. It's roughly the same location centered on Jakarta, as you'll see in a second. So we'll set this again at 1,000 people per square kilometre. You can probably guess this is an unfair comparison because the densities of the city are so high. We're also going to add cropland. So I think 30% per cell, 30% is contributing agriculture. And we'll add the proxy for GDP. And the GDP in this context is important because this means this is more than subsistence income. This is not just a peasant landscape, a village landscape. And we'll zoom out. You can see the intersection, again, with the white lines, the intersection of those three data sets. So it's no surprise this is a much larger region corresponding to that data. So very expansive. Remember, this is the same data set we're applying to 2 different locations around the world. Just to repeat the story, 3 data sets, they're global data sets. They're exactly the same in both locations. The scale of the image is roughly the same in both locations. One centered on Zurich, the other one centered on Jakarta. As I've said, these data sets are mutually exclusive with regard to the conventional definition of the city. It's also mutually exclusive with regard to the conventional definition of the countryside, and yet here they are intersecting. And in the case of Zurich, it's a minor kind of condition, you might say, only 84,000 hectares. So this is a kind of fringe suburban condition, but you can see around Jakarta, it's the dominant condition. So all of the area that you see identified there in that white edge, you can see that Jakarta itself is excluded right here. So this red zone, there's another city here, Bandung, also excluded. So the center of those cities is excluded because nobody's growing crops there. So this is a kind of hybrid definition identifying a kind of region. And this is exactly the region that Terry McGee 30, 40 years ago called Desa Kota. And other scholars have been calling it agropolitan conditions. John Friedman, for example, used a slightly different terminology. So this is the condition that we're interested in. We're interested in understanding it better. We're interested in documenting it better in ways that people like Terry McGee didn't have access to this kind of data. So I think we can be much more precise about this kind of condition. One last thing, if you do the quick maths, you can see that this is about 1 million people inside that condition, and this is about 30 million people in the same sort of condition. So I'm going to take you into a particular site. We're working with some developers who are very active in this region, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we might respond as architects and urbanists after I tell you a little bit more about the site itself. So this is an image of that site. This is classic Desa Kota kind of territory. You can see productive landscapes in the foreground. The productive landscapes are not only rice, but mixing different kinds of higher value crops, vegetables, and so on. But it's also a very kind of mixed use landscape. So don't allow your eyes to be deceived. More than rice, there's all kinds of fruit production going on, horticulture, various kind of forestry efforts, as well as many different kind of mixed use conditions. So, of course, there are housing and kampong and traditional forms of settlement, but also emergent forms, of course, malls and golf courses and transportation centers. Increasingly, there are emerging conditions like hybrid bamboo production, mycelium production, so very dynamic people who are very sensitive and attuned to the possibilities of these kinds of landscapes. So in that respect, the idea of the fringe, as Leslie described it, is certainly true here. That possibilities these are kind of areas of possibility which are slightly outside the typical conventional sort of planned zones of the city and even the development zones of the countryside. So we can also show using that software that if we were to zoom out further, those conditions would roughly intersect with this larger ecological unit called Monsoon Asia. It's partly to do with the very dense rural conditions that pre-exist urbanization. So right through Monsoon Asia, most of these regions are very densely populated in the countryside, often at higher levels than you would find in suburban American conditions, for example. And part of that is to do because it's a rice is the primary economic and environmental system. It's labor intensive, so lots of people have to be on the land to produce rice. They do so on relatively small land holdings, under 1 hectare on average is the global average. It's also a reservoir of labor and water because rice is not necessarily soil dependent. Most of the nutrients come from the irrigation and from the water. So that they're very shallow rooted, it's a very shallow rooted crop. It's relatively low value, but high yield. So very labor intensive, very water intensive, and just above subsistence levels. It's very resistant to mechanization for obvious reasons. It's very hard to put heavy mechanized equipment onto that landscape. And for those of you who've read some of the broader kind of political theory, a lot of people have been talking about the way that system underwrites despotism, highly centralized exercise of power, which of course is quite often debunked. It's a much more sort of complicated situation as we're learning today. People like Clifford Geertz are talking about agricultural involution, and others are even calling this a kind of a bonded labor in which vast numbers of people are connected to the landscape in order to produce these relatively low yields. Now, all of this was massively transformed with the advent of globalization and urbanization, and that's the condition that Terry McGee and John Friedman and others started to theorize, document and theorize. You might know this is a very famous image. This is less famous, but I think also very important, from Terry McGee's essay of 1991. And he's identifying this condition, this hybrid condition called the Desakota, the village and the city. And in this diagram, he's demonstrating a kind of a typology of those different conditions that are starting to emerge from the 90s and the 2000s. So in this process, certain kinds of mechanization, in fact, has unfolded, especially through the leadership of Japanese companies. Land has been concentrated, agricultural regions are being industrialized, there's a commodification of those processes, there's a conversion of peasant into labor, wage labor, there's globalization and urbanization. Now, in this condition, there are a number of different competing positions. One is that this is a condition which is now long gone, it's irrelevant, and it's simply in the process of disappearing. If you follow the debates, for example, in China, the left behind population, the depopulation of the landscape is also typical in many parts of India, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia. On the other hand, a number of researchers are also talking about and demonstrating the persistence of this kind of condition, and not only the persistence and survival and resistance, but also the emerging kind of innovation of these kinds of conditions. And that's one of the kind of themes that I'd like to kind of develop in a bit more detail in this last section of the talk. So this component comes from a piece of work that we've been doing called the Expandable House, and it's related to a broader urban framework called the Tropical Town. There are 5 principles that we've elaborated. Again, these are designed in a way we would like to develop this as a typology that we would like it to enter into the mainstream market. So this is the aspiration of the project. So it has a kind of slightly branded quality to some of these principles. The 5 principles are sandwich section, which I'll describe in a moment, the necessity of producing domestic density, decentralized systems, productive landscapes, of course, and something that we're calling a kind of seed package. This is a typology that can expand in different settings. So let me elaborate some of these ideas in different ways. So the sandwich section, I think, is quite obvious. We're very interested in how do you densify vertically. We know that horizontal densification is possible, but it's a real technical challenge to densify vertically. Any vertical construction is more and more, by definition, more and more complicated to achieve. So we're looking for the simplest possible ways in which we can support the verticalization of domestic urban fabrics. And we do that by producing a sandwich section whereby if you extend the metaphor to the 2 slices of bread, one is the roof itself, which can be elevated, and the other is the foundations, which can support 3 stories. And then we leave it to the residents themselves or community groups to, in a way, produce the filling themselves. So this is our technical contribution to that system. In addition to that, we believe there are a number of essential technical supports which are kind of necessary to this development. Again, if we would like this to be a kind of, if we would like this to be a typology in the architectural sense of that word, we believe that decentralized systems are important. So wastewater has to be kind of managed. So septic tanks, there's a huge amount of interesting work going in that area. Of course, photovoltaic cells generating energy and storing energy locally. Gathering water and storing water locally is also a very significant aspect of this. And many parts of monsoon Asia, in fact, are still subject to dengue and malaria. So managing mosquito populations is really significant as well. And there's a lot of development in organic mosquito traps. So we've also been thinking about that as one of the components that you would need in a way to launch this as a viable typology. The other dimension of the course, and probably the most important dimension, is the incrementality or the logic of temporality in this typology. So this graph shows time along the bottom axis and various kinds of resources in the vertical axis: domestic consumption, resources. So water, energy, and income, as well as the production of waste, are mapped on the vertical axis. And as you can see, we're imagining this is a rapidly migrating urban region. So this is a young couple, for example, and as that couple grows, either through the extension of the family, but extended family, but workers and so on, the social unit itself grows. So the physical footprint of the house grows, which is represented here in these colored bands. But at the same time, so does the metabolism of that house, the domestic metabolism also transforms. So we're very interested in understanding that metabolism in relationship to the space and the physical infrastructure that's provided. So we would like to map those together, and we believe that there are significant components of, again, a responsible and sustainable typology that would be capable of being mainstreamed into that environment that, again, that Terry McGee defined. Slightly more digestible drawings, these are different scenarios in which that intensification would happen. This is organized according to different colors. So dwelling, of course, is significant, but in most of these environments, Dakota environments are diversifying economically. So there are usually not just rural jobs, but all kinds of other associated jobs attached to that. So these are not just dwelling units, but they're economic units. They're supporting, they're funding. They're supporting the domestic economy in quite direct ways. So these are different scenarios for this particular typology. This is a representation of roughly the same image, except in this case, this is empirical information drawn from existing fieldwork. So these are actual examples of diversification of that Dakota economy at the household level. The material dimensions, of course, are very important here, and it was part of the work of Future Cities Lab is that we're working with many different disciplines. So in this case, we're working with Professor Dirk Habel and his colleague Felix Heisel, who I understand is a colleague of yours here in Cornell. So we're very pleased to work with them around their work on innovative hybrid bamboo forms, as well as mycelium. So we've got the very best of that kind of emerging interest around alternative materials that we could integrate alongside the services, the construction, and the sociological dimensions of the project. And as you can see in the foreground, we're imagining this to be a part of an urban fabric, which I'll flesh out at the very end. So this is the limit of our lab. Really, mostly we're in the lab, but with some support, we were able to produce a kind of field lab in which we could start to develop this. And the most complex technical challenge and health and safety challenge, of course, was how to lift a roof 2 or 3 times with the construction going on underneath it. So if this was not possible, of course, the whole project would have been a failure. So this is a project about how do you build, in a way, underneath the kind of umbrella that can be raised and lowered. So this is a very important emblematic image of the project. And this is a key image in a way that launched. This is the first floor. There are three stories worth of concrete underneath here, of course, and this is very hard to market because you can't see it. So the potential of that is a very significant aspect of the marketing of this project. Some images of the inside of it's just the ground floor. Lots of different ways in which we're using bamboo. So bamboo is used in 4 different ways. This is one of the ways in which it's used. This is the most vernacular, direct way of using it. This is threaded and woven. This is aerated concrete, so very relatively low cement content. And the beginnings of the bamboo nursery, which theoretically could be harvested and used to construct other elements of the house, as well as the beginnings of an intensified agricultural unit. So this is our documentation of the process where we're studying the raising and lowering of the roof. We want to understand whether that's possible with just 3 or 4 people, or does it need cranes and all kinds of extra equipment. So this is a very important iterative aspect of the work. Again, we're supported by engineers in the Future Cities Lab. This is the mosquito trap in the foreground, really significant. Not least our own researchers are working in this area. So we had to provide, in a way, a kind of a protective umbrella, if you like, from dengue and malaria. The image that you see, the real fabric is, the experimental fabric is in the top of the image, and this is a mock-up that we're using a scaffolding and printed fabric to in a way shape up the neighborhood, the urbanistic sort of dimensions of the project. This is when all three floors are complete. The people living in the blue house are now experts, and they offer guide, and they'll give you a very good story about Ithaca and urbanization. They're very expert in this process, and you can see that that's the first external testing, environmental testing of that bamboo from the work of Dirk Habel and Felix Heisel. So we're very pleased about the way we can integrate for the first time some of that lab material. And this is the aquaponics and hydroponics growing next to it. The very first crop. And it's a couple of different ways in which you're using the bamboo, for example, but also mycelium board here, again, used for the first time, not on the outside as cladding, but certainly as a very beautiful internal cladding in the house. The commercial dimensions, of course, are very important. So this is an example of the way in which the front room gets converted into a kind of income-generating opportunity. And the reverse of that image is the kitchen itself can be moved around the house, sometimes to serve as a domestic infrastructure, but sometimes as a commercial one, as is the case here. I think you know the background. These are complicated community events. So it's very interesting about positioning technology in a particular kind of community and how we do that. Maybe we could discuss this later, but this is a very significant moment in the story for us. This is the first time that we lifted the roof. So it was a very important milestone in the project. Just 2 or 3 slides to conclude. These are our learnings now from that process. So we've come back to think about that seed package idea, the technological bare bones, if you like. So there are other components. So the garden, the kitchen garden attached to it, but also the very large water, the public kind of water retention infrastructure, which we regard as very important as the project unfolded. Now we're working with developers for this kind of larger neighborhood. So each of these then interlock, tessellate, if you like, into this kind of larger framework. And of course, it's not the only typology, but there are a number of others that we're working on. Mass housing forms, individual gated housing forms, and so on, inside this kind of larger ensemble. And this is our primary, in a way, marketing image, pitch image for this next phase of the work, where most of the elements that I've described are present in some form or other in this image. So without belaboring the point, I want to just emphasize that we got to this very specific constructional sort of moment in our work through the development of the software. Of course, there are many different software packages. GIS, of course, is very significant, but we wanted to have better access to that technology in order to be interacting with that data in a direct way. And we believe that data allows you to identify particular sweet spots, if you like, inside that desiccated region in which these kinds of incremental typologies are needed. Too many kilometers to the east, and it becomes fully urban, in which there's no time for incrementality. The pressures are so great for construction. 2 or 3 kilometers to the west, it's becoming fully rural, and there is no need for these kinds of densities. But as I showed you in that opening kind of image, this is a very large sweet spot. And it's a sweet spot that I invite you as urbanists and landscapers and planners and architects to engage in, because this is a really, really significant, demographically significant project. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Our next speaker is Joshua Bokover from Rural Urban Framework at the University of Hong Kong. Joshua's presentation title is Becoming Urban: Strategies for the Impact Architect. Joshua is an architect and professor at the University of Hong Kong. His work focuses on innovating design strategies in developing regions undergoing rapid urbanization. He started a new enterprise in 2020, District Development Unit, to scale initiatives designed to change how developing regions grow. He has written 3 books: Becoming Urban, the Mongolian city of nomads, border ecologies, Hong Kong's mainland frontier, and rural urban framework, transforming the Chinese countryside. He set up Rural Urban Framework with John Lin in 2005 with the remit to create a not-for-profit agency as a platform for design and research. The projects have received international awards and have been exhibited globally. In recognition for Rural Urban Framework's contribution to the architectural discourse, the work has been acquired by the MoMA and the CCA archive, both in 2020. Please join me in welcoming Joshua. Thank you.
So thanks very much for having me. It's great to be here in person rather than having to conduct these Zoom meetings at crazy times in the middle of the night. So it's really great to be here in person. I'm going to discuss today becoming urban and the role of the architect. But I want to start a little bit by Rural Urban Framework's origin myth. Rural Urban Framework began as an incredibly painful journey with myself and John sat next to each other, going on a trip 8 hours from Hong Kong to a very small village in Guangzhou. And we began to discuss and think about what we were seeing through that car window, the type of territory, the type of landscape, this emergence, as we've already been framed in this conversation, between this kind of in-between fringe landscape. When everyone else at this moment in time was fascinated by the urbanization of the Chinese city, we were focused on the other. We wanted to find out the impact that this urbanization was having on the countryside itself. And we witnessed very different types of contradictory territory, right? Rural agricultural areas surrounded by these suburban developments, strawberry fields with these huge high-rise blocks. And then when we got to the village, people were constructing rapidly, but no one was left in the village. It had been vacated completely. Again, these kind of absent homes, despite this kind of construction that was taking place in there. And into this landscape, into this mix, we began to insert our projects. And these projects began to identify these gaps in the urbanization process, the things that weren't being addressed. And they varied between community centers, schools that reacted to the kind of infrastructural development that was happening around them, public spaces, the injection of community facilities within this landscape. And then again, these kind of missing links, the infrastructures, the micro infrastructures that were needed as a result of the vast infrastructural development that you can see above it. Again, another aspect, the missing links in the social project, the lack of investment in healthcare in China at that time was then reacted by this project to begin to come up with a new model hospital for rural situations. What was interesting that we began to get recognized for this type of work, we even got a footnote in Rem's exhibition that was already mentioned at the Guggenheim. We were cited as being one of the few publications that actually dealt with the countryside against that vast array, the stack of books that were being published in alongside about the city. And in this way, RUF, Rural Urban Framework, represented a kind of different model of practice, that we were working within the lab, within the institution, working through a network of stakeholders as this, what we call this kind of ecology of practice. In a way, the work on our ability to conduct that work reflected an underlying geopolitical period during Hu Jintao from 2003 to 13. It was a heightened period of globalization, whereby China operated as the world's factory, with Hong Kong being that conduit for foreign inward investment. However, of course, as part of that, and is well documented, the real key thing was how we were able to operate through these NGOs, through these network of stakeholders. In the period of Xi Jinping's leadership, we saw a transition, we saw a change, We began to see this intensification of domestic infrastructure, the rapid growth and investment in highways and in the high-speed train. But we also saw that China began to export its model. It began to export its model of infrastructural-led urbanization, which was sort of epitomized by the Belt and Road model, which was launched in 2017. Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption also meant that international NGOs found it increasingly difficult to operate as they had before. And then for us, this fundamentally meant that our model no longer worked. So we had to then begin to work directly with local governments rather than working through an NGO as a kind of intermediary. Without this intermediary that brought kind of finance into the mix, we lost our leverage in projects. We began to lose, without that kind of support mechanism and without that ability to say, this is where the capital is coming from, we lost our leverage. And this was really brought to a head in a project that I suffered through in Sichuan province. It was a village relocation project with the local government, which was helping or coming up with new forms of housing for a village that was being relocated due to the highway construction. And this is what we ended up with. Our hardcore researcher, Yi Sun, trying to gather the village members together so we could have a conversation about the proposal that we were making, and on the other hand, the completely disinterested village official. And of course, the project, in a way, didn't go anywhere. Now, I use this initial framing just to begin to indicate that it was very tied in. Our work and the way that Rural Urban Frame was working was very tied in with that economic model and that geopolitical model of that time. And this project made me realize, and John also, that our model had to fundamentally change. And what we're going to do today is we're going to both explore how we've developed different takes and different approaches that offer alternative roles for the architect. In my line of work or in my research, I came across these kind of realizations. One, that the rate and scale of urbanization in the developing world is simply unprecedented. And this relentless production of urban matter is inextricably tied to the prevailing crises of the 21st century. The climate, of course, and the increasing wealth gap between the rich and poor. For us, in the developed world, this profound urgency, these profound urgencies that we're told about constantly have somehow become diffused and displaced by a kind of abstract other. It's not really me, it's not really us, but it's somewhere else and it's somewhere inevitable. In the elsewhere, in the developing regions, the impact of the environmental crisis cannot be abstracted or mediated. It results in this confrontation of toxic air, polluted water, and increased frequency of natural disasters. When you go to Mongolia, you taste the coal at the back of your throat. There's no escaping this climate crisis at this point. The contingent effects and reciprocal dynamics between the developed and developing regions have to be realigned. But there is some hope. There's an unparalleled opportunity to begin to address this misalignment. The Paris Accord of 2016 offers a chance for us to deal with this disparity. The Green Climate Fund has pledged $15.6 billion from the developed world to impact sustainability in developing regions. At the same time, green finance initiatives, impact funds, and corporate ESG are an increasing reservoir of funds that currently lack credible projects to invest into. This represents a unique moment to position a new role of the architect. And this is my current focus: how to steer the relationship between the developed and developing world in this process of becoming urban. The work is framed with a simple premise. If the building blocks of the city are made up of typologies, then to change the city, we have to change typology. And prototyping, as I try to define it, is a method to develop and test potential typologies. Prototypes are built experiments, allowing for feedback to improve their performance, leading to their potential evolution into a typology. I'm going to discuss briefly 2 projects in very different contexts that demonstrate this approach with the objective to try and change how the developing world becomes urban through typological transformation. Firstly, I'm going to talk about infill housing in Nepal. In 2015, the Gorkha earthquake struck Nepal, damaging over 1 million homes. Only 1/3 of the homes in the Kathmandu Valley, Nepal's most populous urban center, have been rebuilt. At the same time, the demand for new homes is escalating as the Kathmandu Valley is urbanizing at the rate of 50,000 homes each year. Outside of the historic core in these areas, people are building in the same way as any developing country. In a certain way, you couldn't really separate what this looks like to some areas in China and other parts of the developing world. Everyone's building in the same way. 3 to 4 story concrete frame homes with brick infills. And you see that kind of construction taking place everywhere. In the historic areas, however, which has a huge kind of very strong architectural vernacular culture, unfortunately, around 474,000 of these traditional constructed houses were destroyed during that earthquake. And this has led to numerous vacant infill lots that punctuate the urban fabric. In the rebuilding process, vernacular techniques are deemed too expensive, require skilled labor, and therefore are becoming obsolete. So the way people build is they build, again, with the concrete frame house. What's also happened is when people inherit their land, and because land price is high, there's a very numerous disputes between family members. There's arguments, and as a result, the land gets subdivided and subdivided until what we end up with is these very small plots and these pencil towers, almost pencil block apartments, which you see on the left-hand side. So the plots are squeezed and they're still built up from these concrete frames. Very inefficient, doubling up on staircases and things like this. This represents a kind of social issue that also needs to be addressed. The way people are building, again, Stephen brought up, economic activities is vital. So they build a concrete frame and they leave the bottom open. But this is really subject for a future earthquake to what they call soft story damage. So incredibly dangerous way to start rebuilding in the first place. So we started working with thinking about or rethinking typologies for these infill sites, numerous experiments that tried to address differences between the kind of core and the periphery. And through these experiments and starting to work with a structural engineer, we got closer to a model that we thought could work. And the idea was to develop away from the periphery, to not have any foundations at the edge of the sites, which would be subject to failure from one's neighbors, to have a strong structural core, which would then have these steel supports bolted onto it, which would allow the outside envelope to be structurally free, column free, and so that could be filled by the residents as they want, to remove any load from that edge so that it could be more robust during an earthquake failure. The idea as well was that the staircase itself could operate as a kind of double scissor stair, which will allow multiple forms of organization in the building itself. So it could either be used as a one family house, it could be split between two family members into two separate houses, or it could also be used as a kind of apartment house with shop and commercial space left below. Again, this was seismically resilient and robust should an earthquake happen. So we're working now on the pilot project to test and adapt and look at that potential for scaling. Building up models for the facade as well with local carpenters using this traditional sal wood. And again, working with our partners to really try and get the project off the ground. And what's fascinating for me about this project is it really deals with a fundamental issue that policymakers and also development agencies aren't necessarily engaging with. The construction of private houses in emerging economies is an absolute threat to our climate future. But who is responsible for private dwellings? There's been a complete de-investment in public sector housing, not just in Nepal, but around the world. And even development agencies such as the World Bank do not fund private dwellings. So how do we begin to become engaged with this problem or this issue, which is going to have multiple scalar effects? So fundamentally, there's an urgent need to begin to systematically change how people build their private homes to a more sustainable and decarbonized future. Looking at a very different instance, we're going to look at Mongolia, which is a site we've been working on for the last 10 years. For thousands of years, Mongolians have been living in gers, which are these simple felt and canvas tents, which are able to be moved within the kind of nomadic structure. It's a perfect dwelling for the nomads. It can be easily disassembled, it can be easily moved. Yet, when this form of dwelling forms the basic unit of housing for the entire capital city, it is led to these sprawling districts known as ger districts. This is the inside, whether you're in the countryside or the city, the inside of the ger remains the same. The simple structure with a wood or coal-based stove at its center. And the qualities of the ger as a successful nomadic topology, its mobility, its affordability, its reproducibility, have exacerbated the creation of this detrimental urban fabric. When people move to the city, they arrive with their ger, they get a piece of land, they're entitled to a 700 meter squared piece of land, but they're faced with issues that they never faced before when living in the countryside. They're faced with urban issues. It's the first time they've lived with strangers who are not members of their own family. They have to collect water from these water kiosks, up to 8 trips a week just to collect drinking water. They just dig a pit on their land for their toilet. 95% of the entire ger districts only use pit latrines, which has led to much microbiological contamination. And this is not ending. 35,000 people settle in the city each year. And each ger district household uses approximately 4 tons of unrefined coal as their main heating source, leading to very detrimental air pollution in the city itself. So how do we begin to engage with these fundamental questions of what it means to become urban for a nomadic population? Of course, we began to settle or began to focus our work on this basic unit of inhabitation, the ger itself. We started by saying, what could we do to give the ger everything that it doesn't have? Could we provide it with the sanitation that it needed? Could we provide it with a better heating system so people weren't burning coal? Could we provide it with a shower and sanitation as well? And the idea being that people wouldn't have to get rid of their ger, that they could actually add to it and improve upon it. We built our first prototype back in 2017 as a model that we then began to test, and the family has been living in it for the last 4 years. We saw potential in this prototype, and it was well received. But in order to have or engage with the types of complex issues that I've already discussed, of course, this model needs to be scaled. It's not enough to do a one-off. In order to deliver high impact, we would actually then need to begin to redefine and reposition our role as an architect. And this is where District Development Unit comes in, which is an arm of Rural Urban Framework in order to scale up some of the initiatives that we've been doing. So we had to shift our role in a way, and it represented a complex setup between the relationship between Hong Kong U, DDU as a company, and also a new company that we formed in Mongolia to help us deliver that type of impact. We also had to do these ridiculous diagrams in order that for the people or the audience or the types of investors that we want to buy into the project, that we would be using their ways of working. So we're using these kind of theory of change models as a way to structure the methodology to begin to deliver the impact that we are trying to claim. It involved thinking about how we measure impact, not just in the project and the values that we give it, but actually to prove that what we do and the models that we're using actually work. And this doesn't mean just the environmental measured impact, but looking at the types of social impact and really that behavioral change that that project aims to deliver. And we've delivered various types, or we began to evolve and iterate on the project, coming up with different types of models. And looking again at the market research, getting feedback from the families, from the residents themselves, reworking the model into an incremental model, something that Stephen's already mentioned, very important for these emerging economies, to have that capacity for the house to grow itself. And in our case, the product was identified as the only one that can be built in stages, that integrates the GER and can be offer more square meterages for less money. So we began to also put on a new kind of business mind, right? How could we actually begin to take this product to market? But also revising, coming up with other models. Of course, the GER districts are not just are full of very different people with different types of incomes, with different needs. So we investigated another model, which we called the apartment house, with the intention also to deliver and increase the density on these sites as they emerge. So what came about was this idea of collective in situ upgrading, which is very different from the government model, which is basically to say tabula rasa, relocate residents and build new big apartment buildings. We were trying to think of a way to deliver in situ upgrading, working with the residents themselves, or a cluster of 4 residents. And we went back, we looked at different typologies of 4 plots, working with residents, looking at their needs, and coming up with an idea of a manual of incremental development that could help residents decide what they needed and how they could access green mortgages in order to build the houses that they need. Also tied into this idea of a landscape infrastructure, the types of piping, sewaging that they would need to begin to gradually build up the neighborhood in which they live. Coming up with these scenarios. So again, the idea to build up that in situ development so that residents working with their cluster on their land could build up and upgrade their houses gradually over time. I'm now a landowner in Mongolia. I've invested a plot of land in Mongolia, and we're building this pilot to actually begin to prove that our model can work. The only way you can do these types of projects is to actually get your hands dirty and get stuff built and see whether it works. And we're beginning to see, this is the model now. We didn't make it before winter to finish the project, but currently it's under construction, and we hope to finish in the next few weeks. So just to conclude the thinking about this and the linkage between these kind of 2 projects, What I've tried to argue is that the world's climatic future clearly hinges on how these developing regions grow. How we build in these areas will determine how we consume energy and emit carbon for generations. The projects in Nepal and Mongolia aim to help to deliver these scalable products to initiate impactful transformation in the areas in which they're located. And although the contexts are extremely different, the methodology and the approach are the same. It's about enabling this agency for a network of stakeholders through the act of design and construction. And in this way, I try to argue that the role of the architect has changed from our initial project, which was still operating as a type of service provider, into one which can begin to deliver impact. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joshua, for the insightful presentation. The last presentation of today's first panel is by Li Han and Hu Yan from Drawing Architecture Studio. Their presentation title is Portrayal of the Fringe. Established in 2013, Drawing Architecture Studio explores the possibilities of drawing, space, and urban studies in a unique way. They use engineering drawing software as a tool and derived inspiration from architecture, art, popular culture, and daily life to create magnificent and complex images of urban landscape. DAS has exhibited widely in China and abroad, including the 4th Chicago Architecture Biennial, the Chinese and Japanese pavilions of the 16th Venice Architecture Biennale, and many others. Their works were the winning pieces of the World Architecture Festival's Architecture Drawing Prize in 2018 and the Rebar Journal's I-Line Drawing Competition in 2016. And they're also in the permanent collection of the Museum of Modern Art in New York, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, the Art Institute of Chicago, White Rabbit Gallery in Sydney, and the Pingshan Art Museum in Shenzhen, China. Welcome, Drawing Architecture Studio.
Thank you, Leslie, for your kind introduction. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here, and we're very excited to be part of this symposium. And when the first time we heard the title of this symposium, the word fringe, we thought it's really a perfect word. It is not a word to just only to summarize what we are talking about here today in the symposium. It is also a very good word to describe the status of our own practice. So our studio is a little bit different from the conventional architecture office. We don't do physical building designs. Instead, we focus on architecture drawings, models, and use them as tools to do our urban research and to do artworks. Here are some examples of our previous projects. Like we did a lot of large-scale murals as public art in different cities, and try to portray the different urban environment. And also we did a lot of installations for art exhibitions. Mostly the theme are all about urban subjects. And also over the years, we did quite a few publications about urban studies. But our purpose was not to collect data or make any analysis. What we did is more about like visual research, that we try to use models and drawings to observe the city and make our own visual analysis. So today I'm going to share with you two projects. These are kind of like, they are from this kind of like a fringe practice we have in the architecture world. And also the subjects of these two projects are also related to the urban rural issues. The first one is called Taobao Village, Small Acre City. It is a project we did in 2018 for the Chinese Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And the subject, Taobao Village, was given by the curator because the theme of the exhibition that year was our future countryside. And at that time, we didn't know anything about Taobao Village. So we did some research. And Taobao Village is not a name for any physical village. It is actually an economic model. Over the past decades, that with the booming development of e-commerce in China, many farmers, they also found this technology, and they noticed that they can use that to turn their home in the countryside into small businesses. They can produce all kinds of products and sell them over Taobao.com, the largest e-commerce website in China. And they sell products to everywhere in China and also even to abroad. And so more and more farmers and villagers take part in these kind of economic activities. And the company Taobao noticed this development, and they started to certify this kind of village. So they set a standard that if the annual e-commerce transaction or the total number of the online store reached to a certain number, they will certify this village as Taobao Village. So we were really amazed by this concept, this economic model. We decided that instead of doing a portrait for one specific physical village, we want to do a group portrait for the whole concept. And although this portrait is totally fictional, but we hope that to find all the details from reality in the Chinese countryside. The core concept about Taobao Village is actually about decentralization, that the farmers don't have to go to big cities to make a living, and they can stay in their hometown and make a good life. So this reminded us of the proposal Broadacre City by Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1930s. And that concept was also about decentralization. And also, when we talk about Taobao, from the beginning of its startup, it was very often associated with fake products, counterfeit. And so we try to make fun out of this history. And so we think that it will be a good idea to copy to the concept of Broadacre City into our portrait for Taobao Village. So the first thing we want to copy is the master plan. But at the beginning, we decided we need to change the unit because the area in the original Broadacre City is too large for us to draw. And so we changed the unit to a much smaller scale, but we keep the road grid of the original plan. And on the left, you can see that we still have the same road system, but all the buildings become much larger, and the density was also increased. This is why we call our piece as a small acre city. And after we have this master plan, we decided to replace all the buildings in Broadacre City with the actual architecture and the landscape you can find in Chinese countryside. And if you go to many villages in China, you will find that they have really vivid, very robust architectural landscape. Like people in the rural areas, they really have this courage, or if they like something, they like to just directly put that in their life. And very often you will find something really direct, straightforward. For example, this Yuanbao pagoda is filled with this Yuanbao shape as a symbol of fortune. And we really love this kind of directness, so we want to put that, copy it in our Taobao Village. And also, this photo shows a local government building. Apparently, it is a copy of the architecture of Tiananmen in Beijing. And we think it's really also a bold idea and very innovative. So we copied this copy in our drawing. And also, actually, to us, like, we think copying is not necessarily really always a negative thing. It could be a positive design strategy. We want to carry on this spirit in our design further design for the buildings in the village. So we turned Guggenheim Museum into a showroom for a toy factory. And also one of Frank Lloyd Wright's villa into a spa in the mountain. So in our Taobao Village, you will see the combination of both the very wild, crazy, and very innovative local Chinese rural architecture with the beautiful designs from the design masters. Actually, this is quite a realistic image you will see in the Chinese countryside. You see this really liveliness. The ratio of the drawing is 1:2 because it's also given by the curator as they make the exhibition design. So our solution is to make a mirrored layout for the whole drawing. That's on the left, you will see the exterior view of the village. And on the left, you will see the interior. And we want to show how the system works in these kind of Taobao villages. It's interesting that when you go into interiors, you will find that you lose this kind of local character because every workshop, every factory looks very similar. It's hard to tell from the pictures whether it is in China or in the States or Europe or India. We suppose this is also influenced by the globalization. So for the interior part, we decide to use something more generic visual language, like a grid, to put everything into one unity. So here you will see like all the spaces are connected into one. And it also symbolizes this kind of seamless connection between the different parts in this whole e-commerce system. So it's very different from the exterior part. And then for the final drawing, for each venue, you will see a comparison between the exterior and the interior. For example, this is for a logistic company. The logistic is also plays very important role in the whole e-commerce system in Taobao Village. And also for this is a bakery and a comparison between the interior and exterior of the pagoda. This is the exhibition view at the final exhibition in the Venice Biennale. When the time we work on this piece in 2018, in Beijing, there was a really huge movement about de-densification. The government saw that we have too many populations and creating a lot of problems for the city. So they want to push people from outside Beijing back to their hometown. Like most architects, we disagree with this policy, but it also raised the question that if, say, de-densification is a must, is there any feasible solution to do that? We found that actually Broadacre City, it is a proposal for de-densification, and it is not alone. That if we look at the architectural history, you can find many other plans by the greater architects, and they are all about, like, say, moving people to a remote area and establish a low-density urban life. None of these proposals was realized, and we saw that probably it's because their idea was really a kind of against the fundamental concept of city. A successful city is always about density. However, as a contrast, Taobao Village could be seen as an example of a feasible proposal for de-densification. Because for Taobao Village, this economic model, it doesn't require a new master plan. It doesn't require a new mega structure. All the change for the physical space happens in the individual household or the factories. And the whole sole idea is not designed like planned by the government or proposed by any professionals or even not designed by the Taobao company itself. And the farmers, they just found this opportunity for technology and they used it to make a living at their home, and they don't have to rush to the big city anymore. So compared to these two kind of thinkings, like we think that those master plans for de-densification, they are apparently they are, like, say, top-down thinking, and so somehow they maybe lose the some foundation for realization. But the Taobao Village is obviously a bottom-up solution, and it has more ground for feasibility. And so to us, like after we finish piece, we think that Taobao Village is an ultimate realization of Frank Lloyd Wright's idea about Broadacre City. And what's more interesting that after we did this piece in 2018, in recent years, we noticed that there's further development in e-commerce. Now we have the popularity of live commerce. And in China right now, they have many platforms that they offer this kind of live commerce, and business and or individuals, they can sell products on these platforms. And Taobao still takes the lead, but still there are many other competitors. And here is the interface to show on the right, is to show that as a business owner, they always like sell products in front of camera. What's interesting here that it sort of like extends the sale of the business owner, including the farmers in the rural areas, to more spaces. Like they can take the camera, take the mobile phones to the fields or to their workshops to show how the products were grown and how it was produced. And so this is like all these are actually physical space, but as a consumer, what we see from our mobile phone, they become like a virtual space. This actually, we think that it gives a very interesting observation about how this could influence the design of architecture. Usually, like before this kind of e-commerce or live commerce, we focus on the design of physical space, like retail shops or shopping malls. But with this new development of doing business, we need to start to think about how to work with virtual space and or say how to make like a virtual space more interesting to promote the business. And we think that even today, if we need to do another version for Taobao Village, we probably should include the activity of live commerce into the life of Taobao Village. And the second project I'm going to share with you is called the Grand Stage. It is from completely different background compared to the Taobao project. This is an installation project we got commissioned by Artfield Nanhai, Guangdong. Artfield is kind of art event. It's different from the biennales. Usually they happen in the cities. Art field usually take place in the rural areas. The most famous one will be this Etchico Tsumari in Japan. So the purpose of this kind of art field often started with the idea that the local authorities, they want to create some phenomenal events. And so they invite artists from all the places to create interesting works in the local area so that they can attract people from the cities to the area, and so they can get some developments for the local tourism. And later, hopefully, there will be more investment. So this is the background of this, how this kind of art field works. And the location we were given to for this art field is a huge parking garage in a very beautiful tourist attraction, Xiqiao Mountain in Foshan. And so we were asked to make something on the facade of this garage. The interesting part of this location is that the garage sits in a beautiful natural landscape, but itself is really very generic, very out of proportion, and doesn't have any connection to the local culture. But for art fields, usually they will look for this kind of connection between the local and the things from outside the world. So we decided to see that if we can find something local to transform this facade into something more interesting. And first thing we look at into is the local architecture. In southern China, in Guangdong areas, like they are famous for these kind of very beautiful, very heavy decorations on their buildings. And many of these kinds of decorations, they are made by sculptures or paintings. And the subject of the decoration is often about architecture. So literally, they draw building on the building. So we found this kind of similarity between this heritage and our practice. We think that we can put some architecture in the facade of this garage. But then it comes to the question what we should put, what kind of architecture. And then we got inspiration from another tradition in the area. It's called Cantonese opera. Foshan is actually the birthplace of Cantonese opera. And even today in the area of Guangdong, you will still find this kind of outdoor stage everywhere, and many local seniors, they will go to see this performance every day, like their daily routine. Traditionally, theater is not really something really like expensive or takes billions to build. It used to be a very temporary structure. Today in Hong Kong, they still have this tradition that for special events like New Year's, they will build a very beautiful bamboo theater with a really colorful decoration for the facade. And inside you see this massive bamboo structure. And so the audience will come here like for maybe a couple of weeks. And after the event, the whole theater will be demolished. All the bamboos will be recycled and reserved for the next event. And even in some less developed areas, we will see this kind of minimalist stage, say with a couple of bamboo sticks and several pieces of fabrics. You can have this like art installation style stage. So this gives us an idea that we can use fabric to transform this facade of the garage. And also it's important to think that in the local area of this art field, there are a lot of fabric factories. So we think that if we give bring the production to those local factories, we can actually use the money from the art field into the local business, which is also a very good thing. When talking about textile installation, we have a lot of great examples in the world, and some work with pleats, and some with the patterns, abstract patterns. We love both approach, but we think that it would be good if we add some our own signature. We decided to use a scaffolding system because scaffolding is more commonly practiced. It's low cost, as everyone can do that, and also with scaffoldings and the fabric on the surface, you can both have the pleats and also with the patterns if you use different fabrics. But we want to add something more figurative instead of these very abstract swatches. And then we got inspiration from this famous drawing, comic scene by Italian architect Celio. And in this comic scene, he mentioned that to him, the comic scene means that everyday space, that he will put private houses, the balconies, and all the details of the everyday life to show that this happiness on the stage. So we think that for sure for an art event, we want to play comedy. So we want to replace these structures with everyday space in the local area. But instead of this perspective layout, we decided to use axonometric projection because it will be much easier for the scaffolding to construct. So this is the sketch we have originally, and we are happy with the image, but we found the problem that no factory will take the order because they think it is too complicated to produce. They don't know how to start. So we decided that we need to come up with a structure, a system. We asked the construction team to first have these regular grid scaffoldings, where we can just put regularly the horizontal and vertical fabrics. And then we add a second layer of the scaffoldings with a 45-degree diagonal angles. Here we can put the second layer of the fabrics, and then we got this external projection image, and you can see clearly that they are about the local architecture. And in the end, in the front, we have the staircases where people can get to a certain level. In this way, we were able to break down the very complicated image into very simple geometric fabrics with colors and dimensions. It's easy to produce. So very soon, we got a factory to take our order. This is how the fabric was sewn in the factory. And this is how the construction worked on the site. We found that it itself looks like a performance. And this is a final piece in the venue that we deliberately capture all the different lengths of the bamboo sticks, the metal sticks of the scaffoldings. And to us, they look like stitches of the fabric. And then we got both the pleats and the figurative patterns we wanted. This is how it looks like from the inside. With the lighting, the pattern becomes very abstract paintings. Also quite interesting. So with this final presentation, we think that we still have this enormous structure, but we try to find some connection between this building and the local context, local culture. And what's will be interesting for the local people that when they drive their cars into this garage, they will feel like they drive into a drama. So we are turning something every day into a special ritual. What's interesting for us to put these two projects together because we found that they represent two different approaches in terms of rural revival. For Taobao Village, this is an economic model, and the farmers they stay at home, but they turn their business into some virtual space, and they were able to sell products into the cities. And for Grand Stage or the art fields, they are still working with physical space, and they try to make something phenomenal and attract people from the city to their local area and to develop their economy. In both cases, the country and the city, they are not opposites anymore. They become one unity. And such integration doesn't say to eliminate the difference between these two areas. Instead, they create more channels to exchange resources. And if we go back to the term fringe of this symposium, and we think that it used to be it is a word to describe a physical territory where two different things will be merged, and many changes will happen around that area. But with the development of technology, fringe has been fragmented into millions of small interfaces. It could be the computer screen of the farmer at his home-owned business, or it could be this garage facade in the suburb of Foshan. So we think that our work is actually trying to portray this kind of new status of fringe, that we try to collage the interfaces of Taobao Village into a fictional group portrait, and we also try to portray this physical surface of this big mural for the garage. But it can be also viewed as an interface where the city and country have the exchange. So we will think that these two projects will be our response to the subject of this symposium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Huyen, for the beautiful presentation. So I'll invite our panelists to the front, and we can have a brief Q&A discussion session. Thank you so much for all your presentations today. It's really an amazing sort of collection of work here that looks at the context of the fringe from across different lenses and scales, and also sort of scope from material to economies and so on and so forth. And so what I found really amazing is that in all your work, your project, they take on this multi-scale approach. And I think in Lihanna and Huyen's work, you guys are even like incorporating the virtual space now for live commerce, and so that range of scale is so vast, and you've managed to also bring and like define and bring resolution across this range of scales from which you operate. And so, for example, Stephen, in your work where you're looking at selected sets of data, like one would start to think, well, how do you even start to look at the scope of Dakota, but then developing specific mechanism, right, to identify zones or sweet spots, so you call. And then kind of zooming in then into looking at the localized material and so on and so forth. And also in Drawing Architecture Studios work, where you guys are really examining a much larger force, the economic force of e-commerce, and how it starts to redefine the connectiveness and remoteness between the rural and the urban, or the space that is becoming the rural urban, and how that is literally, physically changing the sort of face of these landscape. And also, and then through then the super detailed drawings, right, the scales from which that you operate at, and like seeing a little sheep, a little cattle there. And Joshua, in your work, that was just remarkable, of looking at the type of landscape and the not only the sort of infrastructural, but the sort of economy and the lifestyle behind that. And then again, going into localized regional practices and developing housing typologies. And so I think the work today is here, your work is just really impressive on how that you're able to tie these different threads of scales together. And so maybe my first question is, it is related to how you guys operate at, the range of scales here. And do you think that is due to the sort of uniqueness or the idiosyncrasy of the rural urban fringe? Maybe just to zoom back, to step back as to think about what lessons can we draw from the work that you're developing and operating. Your processes can be applied to, let's say, fringe elsewhere, or is it not possible? Because basically the sort of transition from this super large scale and then to the material and then to the detail, and each of your processes is contextualized in a way derived from the specificity. And how do you think, is that applicable, or would it be different like every time? Like would it be like a different one-off or prototype? Like would that be a different type of prototype? Given in other fringe contexts?
Who would you like to ask?
Sure, I'll start with you.
All right, thank you. Well, for me, it's about methodology, right? And clearly, for me, it was about saying the idea of the prototype is to create new typologies, and through creating new typologies, one can impact scalar change. So for me, the method and that approach can be applied anywhere. In fact, we are applying in the case of Mongolia, Nepal, and future projects in Manila. The question is, the specificity. Of course, the specificity comes through doing the project. It's not the same typology. The method is the same, but of course, the specificity is when you begin to engage, with the ground, with the people that are there, and that dialogue, that conversation is when that specificity begins to come into place. But as a method, yes, it's applicable elsewhere.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I totally agree with Joshua that I think the method can be applied elsewhere. But what changes is always the background or the context of the specific project. And actually, I would like to say that after I see the two presenters' presentations about how they worked in their projects, I was really I really admire that I think the most difficult part is usually not in your own capability, but it is to how to deal with the environment, and how you deal with the maybe the authorities or with the other people who involved in the whole process. So for us, I mean, compared to these great projects that because we do only more like artworks, like we do drawings, or we can hide in our studio. We try not to be so connected to the other parties, so they don't really influence us too much. But still, that very often you will still get this influence for each project. So I think that but I think I just agree that I think the method could be used anywhere. Like you just go to different places and you observe different things, and you can use the same way of thinking. But because the context always changes, then probably the outcome will be different as well.
Okay. I want to say something about the resolution you mentioned in different scales. Actually, when we read this word, we actually discuss with Huyen, what does it mean in resolution? Actually, they have a lot of meanings. So, if the resolution means, to solve some problems, actually, I would say it's not our good part. So, perhaps I think architects should resolve problems, but because our practice is kind of fringe practice, focus on drawing things. Sometimes I feel we are kind of a little powerless to solve real problem, but maybe it's also important to just discover this problem and try to present them. And another resolution actually, which we are quite familiar with, that the resolution of monitor. I mean the very detailed high resolution, which I think is, no matter the drawings about the city or about the house, we always pursue the high resolution as high as possible. Even we draw the top of village is almost like a city. We still will draw the furniture or something like that. To us, maybe only you go to this kind of resolution, you can feel the real real content of the things. Because when you look at things in a kind of larger scale, it looks like they are all the same. They got same problem. They got same. You can use relatively same policy to dealing with this very ground issue. But when it goes to macro scale, it's all different, and it will generate a lot of different results. So basically, I think no matter how different scale is, we always pursue the highest resolution.
Yeah, it's such a great theme, and it came out in everybody's work. So I was thinking about it a lot. Exactly this question. In some ways, scale doesn't matter. The real vector that cuts across all the work that we're all doing is intentionality and agency. So, of course, I love the images that Huyen set up with Akizoom and Kurokawa, excuse me. But it seems to me that those projects are never designed in a way to be realized. So there's a very loose intentionality about those projects. It would take enormous agency to make them real. It would take the GDP of many large nations to make some of those projects real. So in a way, that their purpose is not a kind of straight up, architecture or urban design. It's to change the discourse, or to change what's possible, or change the climate opinion. In a way, Lihan, you talked about shaping the problem. I think that's another way of saying it. But that you want to change. You make the project in which you then act as an architect or a designer or as a builder or as a developer. Then scale matters, because your intentionality is always limited by budget, material availability, all the contingencies of making a building, or all the contingencies of making even a neighborhood. So it seems to me that all the projects were making room for new kinds of projects. And I agree with the way Joshua is using typology. I completely, I sympathize massively with that. But then we all have to do some other preliminary work, whether it's, in a way, this really beautiful aspirational cultural work, or in our case, much more sedate, bit by bit, data by data. So we're all doing it with different kinds of measures of credibility, if you like. that we're all making room for a project. And I think at that level, scale doesn't matter, but it suddenly matters if you have to make concrete or bamboo. And, tying the bamboo, in your case, they become practical acts, and then scale massively matters. But I think we're all very experienced and certainly architecture students are very experienced at moving through those scales, providing you don't try and short-circuit them. That's, for me, is problematic. When somebody says, this is my Archi-Zoom type project and he would like to build it, I think that's a mixing up of the kind of discipline. Sorry, this is extended. I have one footnote here. I think the other thing that came up is the sense of medium in which we're working. So if scale doesn't matter at that level, then I think there's lots of innovations around medium, and I think that's another aspect in which we can bypass the intentionality, if you like, of scale.
Well, in a way, it's also multimedia. I mean, I think what's really remarkable about all your work is that it's not a singular, it's not a design, but in a way, it's more ambitious in the sense that it's seeking to suggest and propose a different mode of operation, like a different mode of thinking about like rural urban futures, not just urban futures, but a future that's specifically tied to these, the sort of fringe space. And I think that's why there's that openness and that space that to develop and hold different types and specific projects, as Stephen, you have mentioned. And so, I'm curious in your work, and I think and you guys have briefly touched upon in your presentation on how the different degree and extent that you work with the local builders and communities, especially Joshua, in your work, is so tied to also letting the local communities like buy into these ideas, right? And so I was wondering how, and this is a question that's been brought up in yesterday's panel as well, like, let's say, architect, as Joshua, you have defined it just now, like what happens or how, what happens to the things that we do, let's say after we leave, right? Like how do, I guess the question is, one is how do you engage with the local community and, working with builders, or is there a learning back and forth from them? I'm sure there is, because all your work is so contextualized. The follow-up question is then what happens after we leave, right? What happens after we've done this design or prototypes, and you talk about, so your work is working with this sort of incremental infill, same with Stevens, right? It's all these step-by-step process, because that's what the Fringe can take on. It tends to transform incrementally. And so I'm curious about the time span, perhaps, or what happens after you've implemented. How do you foresee that process?
Let me go the other way around then.
Yeah.
I can answer that by saying our project was not a community project in a way. We absolutely interacted with the community, but we were there in a way to establish a field lab. They were not in a way clients or co-designers in the project. So they tolerated us and increasingly got interested and so on, but they were never interested in a way to say that we would also like to build these kinds of buildings, because our target were middle-ranking sort of developers who might be able to mainstream that kind of technique. So their role in a way was to be part of that narrative and to be part of they adopted the narrative and understood the narrative and became part of the marketing team. So in fact, if developers come to visit our place, and that's where it does, the house is maintained much more as a demonstration for those kinds of developers. So I was quite serious about the people around in the neighborhood. They can all tell you about the history of urbanization. They can tell you the narrative that I roughly gave you, because that's part of the story of marketing that unit. But it's really a kind of technological sort of package designed to enter somewhere else, not that particular community. However, the people who built the project have established 2 or 3 companies in that area, and they're doing very, very beautiful work. It's based on some craftsmanship that was developed in our project, but nothing like, we didn't design it, quote unquote. They're doing their own. So we seeded some technical skills, which are erupting in quite remarkable ways, but way, way beyond anything that I would personally call. So it's a different kind of agency, again, to use that term.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we kind of we're also not very, working with the community because another thing is it depends on your personality. Sometimes we're not that person that really good at talking with people to establish friendship with. But sometimes I think because we really think it's important to work with community because there you get different kind of ideas. But sometimes there's also a good thing for you just be observer, because when you just observe it, it kind of you're not really involved, but there's certain space you can maybe see something, based on your idea, you kind of create something really different. So since we are not good at communicate with community, so we kind of choose to, just stand back and look at them. Relating to because we actually observe a lot of shops and daily space in our books, publishing books, and recently actually we sometimes will revisit this place to see how this shop's restaurant goes. But to our observation, we find these small shops, restaurants in Beijing actually, it's really hard for them to stay for over 10 years. So it's even 5 years. So it's hard to say there's a restaurant that operate 10 years. It's really rare. So I guess it's kind of really expensive in the big city, and this space is really vulnerable to, such high price. That's we think why these areas are especially, very important and very cherished to be recorded. So we love to observe and record them.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting issue about community and how to begin to engage. And one part of me is thinking how, as a British-born man living in Hong Kong, can rock up in Mongolia or Nepal and say, let's engage with the community. It doesn't make any sense at all, right? But there's a form of agency, I think, of an architect. And a form of agency which is about being a little bit humble, and it's about saying, I don't understand, and I probably cannot understand, actually, the full workings of that place. But to begin to engage through collaboration, right? Everything we do is fundamentally about how we collaborate with people who can do those things that we cannot do. So that role of the architect and one's agency as an architect, I think, has to be, you have to be clearly aware of what you think you can be capable of. I still am a firm believer, though, in the expertise of an architect and what we can do in terms of offering how to begin to, organize and shape space and materialize space. And I think that's where our expertise comes in.
Yes, I see. I'll open to the floor here. I see Lily has a question. Yeah. No.
Can you hear me now? First, I want to say thank you so much to the speakers and to Leslie and Hanshi for such an amazing, mind-opening, inspiring session. I wanted to talk about, pick up on this question that Leslie asked, and then tag on this question of agency, which is super, super interesting. But maybe ask the question in a slightly different way. So a theme that came out of all three talks was the idea of very close observation, refraining from characterizing, or at least using close observation to reveal a reality that's complex, that doesn't fit into existing categories, and then to pose a question of how do we act in places as architects, whether to observe and to describe for better understanding, or to mitigate gaps in provisions, et cetera, and in knowledge. But I'm curious, without going back to taking a top-down approach, I'm curious because every observation, every act has repercussions. And is it possible, and then I think Joshua's work does this a little bit by, building into it observation over time of the prototypes. But I'm wondering that, every act that we do, particularly in a very complex, kinetic, and maybe indeterminate environment that's, or context that is descriptive of so much that's going on, whether one can also ask the question, what are the possible implications, the limitations or the end games of the single act that that one puts into a complex situation, right? I mean, you're not asking the question of, how do I master plan this? That's not what I'm asking, but I'm wondering if there's also a critical element to asking about agency that asks, what are the implications of this one act in this one location that has prototypical implication? Might it have prototypical implication as reverberations for this phenomenon that's going to change because now you've taken a stance within the context? Like every observation, even observations, have impact on reality. So, I mean, it's a question for me because, not specifically to your work, but it's also, I think, a broader question about how do we characterize and self-critique, or how does self-critique of the agency of the architect work when we work incrementally, short of going back to master planning and top-down observation? Are there ways of, I guess, dealing with intentions and their limits? Does that make any sense?
And I think it's an interesting point. Are you advocating, or do you know that you have a position on where the agency of the architect ends?
Are you asking whether I'm asking that, or whether I have a...
Yeah, no, I'm just curious.
No, I don't. Because it's a new situation, right? I think there's a theme of incrementality running through the panel, and it's an argument about how close observation and incremental action might be the ethical and the modest way to act as architects in a very complex situation that we shouldn't control, we don't have control. But I'm curious whether there's room for another critical, self-reflective positioning. We don't master plan, we don't plan utopia anymore, we can't do broader bigger city, but is there another realm of critical reflection on our act at the incremental level, short of just saying, well, we're just going to do it because it's necessary to do that now, and then let's see what happens. I'm just curious, because every action is going to have ripple effects. So I'm curious, philosophically, where you all stand on that capacity, that possibility of critical reflection without going, either like, I can't think the big ideas, I'm not going to go there, or I'm going to ask what this should be in the future. Is there an intermediate critical position that's complementary to the agency of action that you're all proposing?
Yeah, no, I think it's really a great point, and one that we obviously need to reflect on. And I think for me, it's also thinking about how have we lost our skin in the game somehow as architects, right? Why are we no longer in the world of thinking about having significant kind of impact, particularly in the world of, development, how places actually build houses? We're not in the game at all. Our value proposition somehow has been diminishing over time. So, you look back at the projects of, Previ, in the 1970s, architects were forefront on those meetings with the UN. Now, the UN's latest kind of urban reader has no mention of architects. So we've been completely erased from these kind of critical decision-making processes. The way back is not just to try and, we're just not at the table, we're not invited to the table. So to get back into thinking about how we might begin to trigger other possibilities of other development, for me, is through, in a way, incrementality, through thinking about scalability, how these types of prototypes, development strategies can actually begin to have influence. Mm-hmm. So for me, is a kind of a way to position the architect to still begin to increase one's value proposition through building up this case about impact. And impact for me is about thinking how what we do well can be measured, can be tangible, can be brought into reinforcing a type of position. And that requires time, right? Which is one of the things that you mentioned at the beginning, which is a longer time frame of a project. It means that you cannot stop when the project's done. And it means it has to be iterated upon. It has to go a few times before it get to the point when the type of reverberations, the type of things which involve that behavioral and policy change can begin to take place.
Just to add to that, I think incremental housing and architecture has this very strange history, actually. And you mentioned Previ. It's got quite a long history, but I think it's a strangely unsuccessful history. I don't think there is a single incremental housing project that's gone beyond the demonstration and the exhibition. And Previ is a beautiful example. We all think about it, but I don't think it's entered into not many principles enter into the mainstream. Lots of great examples in India, from Doshi's work, for example. And then Aravena, of course, suddenly a single incremental project in South America was revived and then became this global phenomenon. But whether any of the knowledges of those projects enter into the mainstream, I think is really doubtful. And I'd be interested in Joshua's position on this, because I think we should study that. And but to come to your question, so I'm quite skeptical of incrementality in that older development model. However, what is abundant now is data. So I would absolutely insist on this as a non-data scientist, but who's looked over the shoulder of many colleagues working on data in Future Cities Lab. I'm absolutely convinced that bringing our capacity to think through available data sets and to reshape them and to narrate those data in different ways, that comes back to us to shape the project. I do think that we all have capacities in this room to shape the project otherwise, but it's not going to happen exclusively through exhibitions and proposals. It's got to have credibility, and for me, one of the biggest tokens of credibility at the moment is data. I know that that's a very bold statement because there are many things that can be said in the name of data, but it's really significant. And again, a kind of footnote, the reason we dived into developing the software because we wanted to be able to tell that story in our own terms, in our own language. And we felt that the existing software packages were not able to tell the data that we wanted to tell, and we weren't able to combine them in particular ways. And most essential in that respect was it's very hard to combine rural and urban data these are sort of siloed data sets. The FAO and the UN urbanization prospects very rarely talk to each other. So that was one of the aspirations for it. So we want to have our cake and eat it too. I think, to come back to your question, I'm skeptical of the agency of incremental housing, that tradition, but combine it with the availability of data, then I think there's something very interesting possible.
Yeah, maybe I have something to add to this as well. I think also from the conversation from yesterday is that it is really interesting that we're in this zone in between, that we can't come in as top down, but nor can we just entirely rely on the bottom-up processes, right? And I think some of the points that were mentioned today about coming in and collaborate and learn from local, and I think our expertise, maybe in my own work, it's not necessarily like I'm the builder architect, but in the sense that how do we develop nimble design strategy? Like how can we operate in a more nimble way and adaptive way that if we have a certain processes or way to engage a particular spatial or cultural issues, coming into the zone and extracting and mining what we can adapt in a way, and so whether it being more temporary ephemeral installation, working with like the sort of local sort of industry, or being actually looking at housing shortage or building practices. I think it's important for us to be maybe be available to adapt and change, and be nimble in our design strategies. Great.
If I may ask the question that perhaps piggybacks on the discussion that's already happening. So, Stephen, what you mentioned about the data being right now categorized as urban, and one other set of data categorized as rural, I think speaks to Lily, your point about observation having its own impact, because we see the world as this binary, that we categorize it as binary, which means that it only facilitates further design through that binary. And what I think is really interesting about all of your work, that in comparison to Broadacre City, in comparison to all these utopian massive visions, is that whereas those visions kind of were inspired by technological advances or these kind of very top-down things, that you guys' work are inspired by this emergence or like self-discovery of already existing conditions. For example, the Ithaca is a discovered phenomenon, it's not created. And the Taobao village is also already happening because people saw an opportunity. Like you said, it wasn't even instigated by Taobao, it was instigated by the people who saw that they could do it. And so I wonder, maybe do you see there has been a shift in thinking about urbanism from that kind of past utopian vision to the current utopian vision that seems to be a little bit more connected to taking inspiration from what already exists outside of the discipline? And I wonder if you want to speak a little bit about, in terms of pedagogy, does that mean that now as architects we need to have more skills in terms of researching and understanding what's happening outside rather than just creating what we think should be there?
I mean, I'll be very short. I completely agree with you. Thank you for bringing it back to the question of observation, which I think was at the core of your question. So I do think the way you've set this up, the condition of the fringe, and in McGee's essay, he talks about the Ithaca condition as being a grey zone, loosely governed, where all kinds of possibilities are kind of emergent. So it's an emergent condition. And in that respect, I do think then it demands on us a certain way of looking, a certain way of seeing, a certain way of observation. And that does mean a certain kind of learning how to do that. Yeah, so I agree with that. But I like the way that you connected with the Taobao phenomenon as well. So that was...
Well, and going back to your Lihan, you were talking about observing the importance of seeing, right? And what was really interesting is it is important to stand back and see and observe because this space is in flux. Like you said, the shops and these stores, they don't operate, let's say, beyond several years of time span. And the fact that it's always in flux, I think going back to Lily's question or increment, about the development is that it is hard to plan. You almost can't plan for it because the space is bound to change, and that's what makes it so interesting, right? So I don't know if Huyan or Lihan, you guys have anything else to add to this?
I will also agree with Hansi's observation about this kind of like we talk about these big ideas from our from the masters in the history, but now it seems that I also noticed that even though we for all projects we present here, that built works or like us unbuilt, not to be built works, but we all started from observation of the existing environment, from the everyday space and how people already live in a way, and then we started our own design or own drawing or artworks. So I don't know why. Probably this is just a shift, fundamental shift, just in the way how we look at the world. Maybe I think because people are different or generation maybe different. Maybe currently we are we're not still maybe some people they are. More fond of big ideas, but also many people we are focusing on the small things. That things more manageable and more noticeable, and so we feel really connected, emotionally and also conceptually, and then we can. It feels more natural for us to work with this kind of existing context and to start our own creation. So this is just a different way or different approach, but it could be also we create something very interesting.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, and thank you for all your comments and sharing your thoughts about the sort of collective work that's happening here. And so we will wrap up this panel and then take a coffee break, and we'll restart at 4:30. Okay. Wait, is it 4:30 already? Oh, I don't have my. Sorry. Okay, so let's restart in 15 minutes at 4:45. Thank you for your patience. Thank you.